Okay, we need to jump right back into the discussion that we were having on Tuesday. We spent the class meeting talking about the expansion of voting rights without respect to gender and race and ethnicity. Okay? I'm not going to go back through all that stuff again. Oftentimes, as you probably picked up, I like to take at least a couple of minutes at the beginning of the class meeting to go back through some of the major points that we talked about in the previous class meeting. I'm not going to do that today, mainly because you'll remember that that file that I had some issues. I'm not going to reopen that file. I'm just going to leave it alone until I can have time to go in and fix it for another semester. Okay? So I will do this, though. I'll give you a second here or two to look back over your notes from Tuesday. And if you have any questions about any of that stuff that we covered, I'll try to answer it without the benefit of any visual information. Let me take this off so that we're not distracted. Also, let me do this. While you're looking at your stuff.
Oh, I don't think I got the year, or like I was trying to figure out were Latinos able to vote before Africans?
Well, one of the points I was trying to make was that in Texas, the restrictions on Latinos weren't as formalized or codified as they were against African Americans. Remember, for example, that the white primary didn't really apply to Latinos, right? I mean, it was specifically to prevent African Americans from voting in the Democratic Party primary. Yeah. But certainly the poll tax would have impeded a lot of Latinos from exercising the right to vote. Other maybe literacy tests and others would have affected Latinos as well. But I think the truth of the matter is that the main effort, not only in Texas, but in other states, particularly in the South, it was mainly to keep African Americans away. And I think that the reality was at that time that political leadership, the white leadership, didn't worry too much about Latinos because they just didn't have much of a pattern of participation, of even trying to participate. Yeah. Well, so I could be wrong about that, but that's sort of my impression. So the main feature that we want to associate with the restrictions on Latino voting was that boss system stuff that we talked about.
The what?
The boss system, the boss control that we talked about, where the political bosses may have either discouraged their Latino constituents from participating or to participate in a certain way, like to sort of guide their vote. Go ahead.
This is another topic. What was education like around that time? Like for just anyway, was it mostly just white people that were in school? Or?
Well, no, I mean there were public schools for African Americans and Latinos, but remember they were segregated.
Yeah.
Right? Were Hispanics segregated from the white schools too? That seems like a lot of schools.
Mainly by virtue of where people lived.
So you see.
See, those are good questions, and I'm certainly not an expert on this sort of stuff, but there were in many states, including Texas, laws on the books that prohibited African American and white school children from being educated in the same building. Okay, so you actually had separate school buildings for whites and blacks. I don't know of any laws, codified statutes that would have prohibited Latino children from, but I think they attended Latino schools that were predominantly Latino schools just because of where they lived, right? As long as we have the concept of neighborhood schools in our public school system, and neighborhoods are segregated, then schools are going to be largely segregated as well. That's, by the way, a problem that persists down to today. particularly at the elementary and middle school level.
Yeah.
Okay, good question though. The honest answer though is I don't really know if there were specific laws that prohibited that. All right, so one of the things that I didn't mention last time, and I don't want to be remiss by not mentioning it, is in part of this whole effort to extend or to eliminate the discriminatory restrictions on voting, again, particularly but not exclusively against African Americans. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. This is one of the most significant pieces of legislation ever passed in this country by the United States Congress, together with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the year before. These are landmark achievements. This really isn't the forum to discuss the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and I'm not going to go into the Voting Rights Act in any real detail. I just want to say that what it basically accomplished was that Congress is saying to the states, all these restrictions that you've been using, like grandfather clauses and literacy tests and all this other stuff that we were talking about last time, they're now illegal under federal law. I think that's as simple as I can say it, right? But there was one additional piece, right? It also empowered the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice. Anybody know what the Cabinet Secretary is called for the Department of Justice? You know how we have a Secretary of Defense and a Secretary of Agriculture?
Is it state, no?
Is it what?
Secretary of State.
One more time, I can't hear.
Secretary of State.
No, Secretary of State is the is the head of the Department of State.
Oh,
Secretary of the Interior.
No, it's the Attorney General.
Oh.
It's a trick question. We don't call the Secretary of the Department of Justice a secretary. Call it the Attorney General. Okay. Anyway, empowers the Attorney General, the Department of Justice generally, to review any state laws from any of these states that had a historical or contemporaneous pattern of discrimination on the basis of race in their voting laws. Anytime they want to pass a new election law, a new voting law, it has to be cleared by the Department of Justice. Presumably the Department of Justice is going to make a determination about whether it's discriminatory. You see, the idea here is to give up to that point, if a person believed that their voting rights were being discriminated against, they had to go to court. And they had to get a court to enter a finding that they had been discriminated against. This is kind of a preemptive thing. It's an affirmative action, if you will. Right? Government, the national government, Congress is trying to take affirmative action to stop discrimination before it happens. So they're saying Texas, because it has a historical pattern of discriminating on the basis of race, contemporaneous, Texas had a white primary. Texas had poll taxes. Texas had grandfather clauses. Texas had all these devices that we talked about last time that were designed to keep people away from the polls on the basis of race. So Texas, South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, all these states that are applied to, I'm going to show you a map here in just a second, or we're going to look at a map here in just a second. Any of these states that have this pattern of having these kinds of laws, if they're going to, all those laws that they have are now illegal under federal law, okay? And any new laws that they pass are going to have to be cleared by the Department of Justice. It's called the pre-clearance provision. Yes?
It does kind of sound like, though, like the federal government's kind of taking a little bit of control of states' rights.
I think that is not an inaccurate way to, states' rights, I don't know about that. That's the way people tend to talk about it. Without going into too much about digression here, I would encourage you to not, we have historically used the term, Americans have historically used the term states' rights. I think it's a very bad term. Governments don't have rights, governments have powers. That's what I would say. Stop using that term states' rights. People have rights, okay? Individuals have rights, governments have powers. So what you're saying is a valid point. I'm just trying to get you to tweak a little bit so that the logic that we're talking about here might make a little bit more sense. So we're talking about, there are going to be some who argue, oh, the federal government is encroaching upon the reserved powers of the states because it's the state's power to write the election laws. And that is true under our Constitution. And you can bet those arguments were made in the mid-1960s and in the years that followed repeatedly, that this is a encroachment of national power on state power. So yes, you're right. That is an argument that could be made and was made. Okay? But I think what Congress is saying in response to that is, again, I hope I'm not oversimplifying, but trying to be as straightforward as I can. I think Congress is saying, well, we don't really trust the states. We see what happens when you leave it to the states. They discriminate against people. They discriminate against people on the basis of race. So we can't really, there's a higher imperative here under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. Because the 14th Amendment does empower Congress. You can look at the 14th Amendment yourself. I don't have it called up already, so I'm not going to take time to call it up. But if you look at the 14th Amendment, it empowers Congress to make laws to prevent the states from discriminating on the basis of race. And so I think Congress in the mid-1960s would have said, we're just acting consistent with our power under the 14th Amendment. Okay, now there's more to come, okay? But I want to make sure everybody's comfortable with this part of it so far, okay? So this central clearance provision that empowers the Department of Justice to review state laws was the enforcement piece. It's one thing for Congress to say, we're not going to let the states discriminate on the basis of race. It's another thing altogether to have a way to enforce that. Okay? However, not that long ago, back in 2013, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Shelby County versus Holder. Shelby County, this is Shelby County, Texas, but this is Shelby County, Alabama. Case that came out of the state of Alabama, and the Supreme Court struck down the provision of the Voting Rights Act that required central clearance by the Department of Justice. As a result of that,
What is the U.S.?
now if a state like Texas wants to pass a new election law, it doesn't have to first get the approval of the Department of Justice. For example, if the state of Texas wants to pass a photo ID law that requires voters to present a photo ID, it doesn't have to get that cleared through the Department of Justice.
So it just happened.
It just
That's
happens.
recent too, that's.
Yeah, I mean, this is fairly recent, yeah.
So did that revert what,
1965.
did it revert what powers he gave to the 1965?
No, it doesn't negate anything. It's essentially about the future. So beginning with this decision in 2013, what the court is saying is all of these states that are affected, and again, you'll see a map here in just a second that'll show you the states that are affected, okay? These states that are affected no longer, as a practical matter, really have to get their new election laws cleared by the Department of Justice. And the reason was basically that the majority of the court, there were some very strong dissents, okay? Some of the justices, I think it was a 5-4 decision, okay? So the 4 that were in the minority were strongly dissented. But the basic view of the majority was that the conditions that existed at the time that Congress wrote this law in 1965 no longer exist. And so if we're going to have this central clearance provision, Congress is going to have to write new law that frames the parameters of what the Department of Justice can do. It's kind of a technicality when you put it that way, but the practical effect of it was, as I said, that states like Texas and any other state for that matter began passing election laws, new election laws that some people viewed as discriminatory, that some people view as, you do understand that there are people out there who oppose the voter photo ID law because they believe it's discriminatory. So we can get into that here in just a few minutes. You know, you have to scratch a little bit beyond the surface because a lot of people are gonna say, well, what's wrong with making somebody show a photo, show who they are, who they are? Well, we'll get into that. Okay, yeah.
I think that this subject's really relevant to the 2020 presidential election because there was a lot of voting rights stuff going on. Like even Texas tried to sue a couple states because they supposedly, if I remember correctly, changed their voting laws on the spot without going through their own state's constitutional procedures, which changed.
Yeah, those are a little bit different issues. You're certainly right about that. But the issues that were raised, I'm not going to pretend I followed those cases intimately, but what I know about them, the issues that were raised really wouldn't be issues that would have been implicated by the Voting Rights Act.
I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. It is very interesting. The 2020 election raised a lot of questions about state election laws and differences among state election laws and whether or not when can states change their election laws and can they change their election laws this way or that way. It raised a lot of very interesting questions and that we'll be working those out for years, I'm sure. Okay, so this is a very important case and I want to show you this little slideshow video. I think it helps drive this point home, okay? So I didn't produce this, okay? This is from actually the SCOTUS blog, Supreme Court of the United States blog. Let's see if this opens.
Oh, that's the USS Stevens, United States Supreme Court.
Yes, SCOTUS. Yes, it's a Supreme Court of the United States. Well, I thought it was gonna. I should have opened this before we started. Oh, there it is. Gotta scroll down. Okay, you ready?